Miss Marple and the bell tower that rang itself. Welcome, dear friends, to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I cannot tell you how much joy it brings me to know you choose to spend your evenings with these stories. Each tale takes time and love to prepare, but your kindness and the way our little community grows make it all so meaningful. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. If you haven't yet, do subscribe so you never miss a new mystery. Now, let's gently turn the page and begin tonight's story. Chapter 1. Rain at 10:03. Bells. The rain came down in sheets that October evening, drumming against the windows of the cottages in St. Mary Mead with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her comfortable chair by the fire, looked up from her knitting as the sound intensified against the glass. The wool, a soft lavender shade destined for her great-nephew's new baby, lay temporarily forgotten in her lap as she listened to the storm's fury. Quite a downpour, she murmured to herself, noting how the wind caught the rain and flung it in wild patterns across the panes. It reminded her of nothing so much as her late gardener's wife, who had possessed the same fierce determination to make her presence felt, whether welcome or not. The village had settled early that evening, most sensible folk having drawn their curtains against the weather. The high street lay empty, its cobblestones gleaming like black mirrors under the intermittent glow of the street lamps. Even the Red Lion had sent its last patron home before 9, unusual for a Saturday night. It was therefore all the more startling when, at precisely 3 minutes past 10, the deep bronze voice of St. Luke's great bell rang out across the sleeping village. Once, twice, 3 times. Miss Marple's needles stopped their gentle clicking. She tilted her head, listening intently as the last reverberations died away into the rain-soaked night. How very curious. There was no bell practice scheduled for this evening. Indeed, Ezra Pottle, the bell captain, had mentioned only yesterday that they would not meet again until the following Thursday. The sound troubled her in a way she could not quite define. It was not merely the unexpectedness of it, though that was certainly odd enough. There was something else, something about the spacing of those 3 strokes that seemed almost deliberate. She rose and moved to the window, peering out through the streaming glass toward the dark bulk of the church tower. St. Luke stood solid and ancient against the stormy sky, its Norman stonework black with rain. No light showed in any of the tower windows, and the church itself lay in darkness, save for the small red sanctuary lamp glowing dimly through the chancel window. Most peculiar, Miss Marple murmured, returning to her chair, but the knitting remained untouched as she sat thinking, her pale blue eyes thoughtful behind their wire-rimmed spectacles. The morning brought a clearing sky and the crisp, washed air that follows a night of heavy rain. Miss Marple was early abroad, as was her custom, making her way along Church Lane with her usual unhurried step. The storm had left its mark everywhere. Broken branches littered the path, and small rivers still ran in the gutters, carrying the last of the night's deluge toward the village green. She was not surprised to encounter Dr. Haydock emerging from his morning rounds, his medical bag in hand and his gray hair slightly disheveled from the wind. "Morning. Miss Marple," he called, his weathered face creased in its familiar smile. "Trust you weathered the storm well enough. Quite a blow we had. Indeed, doctor, though I confess I was puzzled by those bells last evening. Did you hear them?" Dr. Haydock paused, his expression growing more serious. "That I did. Odd business, that. Can't think what Potley was about ringing at such an hour." Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of hurrying footsteps. Mrs. Pringle, the church charwoman, appeared around the corner of the churchyard wall, her usually ruddy face pale with distress. "Oh, doctor," she called breathlessly. "Thank goodness you're here. Something terrible's happened at the church. It's Mr. Trench. She paused, struggling for words. "He's dead, doctor." Dead in the bell chamber, and Inspector Slack wants you to come at once. Dr. Haydock was already moving, his long stride carrying him quickly toward the church. Miss Marple followed more slowly, her mind already turning over this disturbing news. Horace Trench, the church warden, a man not much liked in the village, but respected for his business acumen and his efficient, if somewhat heavy-handed, management of church affairs. The churchyard was already bustling with activity. Inspector Slack's motor car stood near the lich gate, and Constable Lake could be seen keeping watch at the tower door. Several villagers had gathered at a respectful distance, their voices low with a particular excitement that accompanies unexpected drama in a quiet place. Miss Marple recognized most of the faces. There was Ezra Potla, the verger and bell captain, his usually neat appearance somewhat disordered, standing in earnest conversation with Harold Lyme, the village clockmaker. Agnes Whitby, the church organist, stood slightly apart, her pale hands clasped tightly before her while nearby. Mrs. Pringle dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. As Miss Marple approached, she caught sight of the Reverend Leonard Clement and his wife Griselda emerging from the vicarage. The vicar's usually cheerful countenance was grave with concern, while Griselda, despite the early hour, appeared characteristically composed. "Miss Marple," the vicar called, noticing her approach. "I'm afraid we have rather dreadful news. Poor Trench has met with an accident in the bell tower." "So I understand," Miss Marple replied quietly. Mrs. Pringle mentioned he was found in the bell chamber. Inspector Slack appeared at the tower door, his heavy form moving with his usual brisk efficiency. His sharp eyes swept the gathered crowd with evident displeasure. "Now then," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the churchyard, "I'll be wanting statements from all of you. But first, I need to know who was the last to see Mr. Trench alive yesterday evening." There was a moment of uncomfortable silence before Ezra Potley stepped forward. A precise man in his 60s, with the careful movements of one long accustomed to handling delicate mechanisms. He removed his cap respectfully. "That would likely be me. Inspector," he said in his quiet, measured voice. "I encountered Mr. Trench near the church at approximately 7 yesterday evening. He was examining the tower door, seemed to be checking the lock." Inspector Slack made a note. "And what was your business there, Mr. Potley?" "I had come to ensure all was secure for the night. It's my responsibility as verger, you understand. Mr. Trench mentioned something about checking on the bell chamber, though I thought it odd at the time." "Odd how?" Potley hesitated slightly. "Well, Inspector, there was no reason I could think of for anyone to be in the bell chamber after hours. No practice scheduled, no maintenance required. I asked if he required assistance, but he rather dismissed me." Miss Marple listened to this exchange with growing interest. She had known Horace Trench for many years, known him as a man of rigid habits and predictable routine. The idea of him venturing into the bell tower on a stormy evening struck her as remarkably out of character. Inspector Slack was continuing his preliminary inquiries when Dr. Haydock reappeared from the tower, his face somber. He drew the inspector aside, and though their conversation was conducted in low tones, Miss Marple's sharp ears caught enough to understand that death had been neither peaceful nor natural. The word accident was mentioned several times, along with references to skull fracture and bell rope. It began to form a picture in Miss Marple's mind, a picture of a man alone in the darkness of the bell chamber, perhaps investigating some disturbance, and meeting with a tragic mishap among the ancient machinery of the bells. Yet something about the entire situation continued to trouble her, much as those 3 deliberate strokes had troubled her the night before. In her long experience of village life, she had learned to trust such instincts. They had, more often than not, proved remarkably reliable. Chapter 2. Tower Door on the Chain. The ancient oak door of St. Luke's Tower stood slightly ajar, its iron hinges creaking softly in the morning breeze. Inspector Slack examined the heavy chain and hasp that secured it, his thick fingers tracing the links with professional interest. Locked up tight. It was, he announced to the small group gathered behind him. Mrs. Pringle here found it this morning when she came to do the flowers. Chain's been cut clean through. See here, the bright metal where the bolt cutters bit. Miss Marple stepped closer, her keen eyes studying not the obvious break in the chain, but rather the way it hung from the hasp. Something about its arrangement struck her as curious, though she could not immediately say why. If I may, Inspector, she ventured quietly, might one ask who holds keys to this door? Slack consulted his notebook with the air of a man who preferred facts to speculation. According to the verger here, there are 3 keys. One kept by Mr. Potley himself, one by the vicar, and one that's held by whoever requires access for church duties. Ezra Potley nodded his confirmation. The 3rd key was with Miss Whitby yesterday evening, he said, glancing toward the organist. She had requested it for practice, as is her custom on Saturday evenings. Agnes Whitby, a thin woman of perhaps 45 with prematurely gray hair pulled back severely, flushed at the attention. I returned it to the vicarage as always, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Through the letter slot, as is customary when the vicar has retired. What time would that have been? Slack inquired. Shortly before 9, Agnes replied, though her hesitation was noticeable. Perhaps 20 minutes before. I had finished practicing by 8. The Reverend Clement, who had been listening quietly, frowned slightly. I'm afraid there may be some confusion about the timing, he said apologetically. I distinctly remember checking for the key at 9:15, as I always do when Miss Whitby has been practicing. It wasn't there then. I found it later tucked under the doormat, but not until nearly 9:30. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Miss Marple observed the various expressions with interest. Agnes Whitby's increased paleness, Inspector Slack's suspicious frown, and the evident distress of the kindly vicar at having contradicted one of his parishioners. Well, then, Slack said briskly, we'll sort that out presently. Now let's have a look inside. The tower door opened onto a narrow stone staircase that wound upward into darkness. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, the edges rounded and hollowed by countless feet. Slack produced his torch and began to climb, the others following in single file. Miss Marple, bringing up the rear, noticed immediately what the others had missed in their haste to ascend. On the 3rd step from the bottom, the ancient stone bore a scatter of damp sand, the sort one might find in a church porch after a rainy evening. But it was the pattern of disturbance that caught her attention. The sand had been scuffed and displaced, as though someone had stumbled or slipped. More interesting still were the dark spots she observed on several steps above. Circular marks that could only be water drops leading upward in an irregular trail. The drops were too large and too well-defined to be condensation, and their pattern suggested they had fallen from something carried by a person climbing the stairs. "Inspector," she called softly, her voice echoing in the narrow space. "I wonder if you might spare a moment to examine these lower steps." Slack paused, his torch beam swinging down to illuminate the area Miss Marple indicated. His expression sharpened as he took in the evidence. "Wet sand and water drops," he muttered. "Someone was here last night after the rain." Started right up. He made careful notes of the positions and patterns before continuing upward. The staircase opened onto the ringing chamber, a circular room perhaps 15 feet across with massive wooden beams supporting the floor above. Here hung the bell ropes, 6 of them, their colorful sallies tied off neatly against the walls. The smell of old wood and metal oil pervaded the space, along with something else, a faint dampness that seemed out of place in this usually dry environment. Harold lime, The clockmaker had preceded them into the chamber and stood examining the rope arrangements with professional interest. A small, precise man with gentle hands and mild eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He possessed the patient demeanor of one accustomed to working with delicate mechanisms. "I say, Inspector," he offered quietly, "something's not quite right here. These ropes, they're all tied off properly, as they should be when the bells are left down." "But that's odd, considering what?" Slack demanded. "Well," Lime hesitated, glancing at Potley for confirmation, "if the great bell rang last night, as we all heard, she'd have to be pulled up first. But all these ropes showed the bells were left in the down position." "Bells don't ring themselves from the down position." Potley nodded gravely. "Mr. Lime is quite correct, Inspector. The bells must be raised to the up position before they can be struck. It's impossible otherwise." Inspector Slack's frown deepened. "Are you telling me that someone climbed up here, raised the bell, rang it 3 times, and then lowered it again before leaving?" "That would be the only explanation," Potley replied, though his tone suggested he found it as puzzling as the inspector did. Miss Marple had been examining the chamber with her usual quiet thoroughness. The circular room was dominated by the wooden framework that supported the bells above, and she noticed that the massive timbers showed the wear and polish of centuries. But on one particular beam, she observed something that made her pause. A faint groove marked the wood, so subtle it might easily be overlooked but definitely present. It ran for perhaps 2 feet along the upper edge of the beam, as though something had been drawn across it repeatedly under light tension. The groove was fresh, she was certain, for the wood within it showed lighter than the surrounding timber. "How curious," she murmured, running her finger gently along the mark. "What is it, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock inquired. He had remained largely silent during the examination, but his medical training had taught him to observe details carefully. "This groove," she replied thoughtfully, "it appears quite recent. And see here." She moved to examine the corner of the chamber, where several items of church maintenance equipment were stored. "This leather bucket is rather damp inside, though it's been hanging here all night in what should be a dry space." The bucket in question was an old fire bucket, its leather cracked with age, but still serviceable. Miss Marple lifted it carefully and noted that the interior bore a distinct ring of moisture, as though it had been filled to a particular level and then emptied. "And this watering can," she continued, examining a battered tin vessel hanging from a peg nearby. "How interesting! There's what appears to be a tiny hole in the spout. Deliberately made, I should think, judging by its neat edges." Inspector Slack was growing impatient with what he clearly considered unnecessary attention to trivial details. "Look here, Miss Marple. We've got a clear case of breaking and entering, followed by accidental death. Fellow cut the chain, climbed up to the bell chamber, probably looking for valuables, and got himself killed by the bell machinery. These other bits and pieces don't signify." But Miss Marple's attention had been caught by something else entirely. In the stone wall near where the victim had been found, there was a shallow recess containing various small tools and supplies. Among them lay a workbox of the sort used by church seamstresses for altar cloth repairs. Opening it carefully, she found the usual collection of needles, thread, and small scissors. But one item seemed slightly out of place, a darning needle whose point gleamed brighter than the others, as though it had been recently used and carefully cleaned. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe there may be more to this matter than it initially appears. These small inconsistencies, the wet bucket, the pinhole in the watering can, the fresh groove on the beam, they suggest a rather more deliberate arrangement than simple coincidence." Slack snorted dismissively. But Dr. Haydock looked thoughtful. "What sort of arrangement do you have in mind, Miss Marple?" "I'm not entirely certain yet," she admitted. "But in my experience, when several small, Seemingly unrelated anomalies appear together in circumstances such as these. They often form a pattern when viewed from the proper perspective. As they prepared to continue up to the bell chamber, where the body had been discovered, Miss Marple cast one final glance around the ringing chamber. Her instinct told her that this room, rather than the chamber above, held the key to understanding what had truly occurred on that stormy night. The rain had stopped, but its effects lingered everywhere. In the damp sand on the stairs, the water drops that had fallen from something carried upward, and the mysterious moisture in what should have been a dry leather bucket. Someone had indeed been here after the storm began, but their purpose remained tantalizingly unclear. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a pinhole. While Inspector Slack continued his methodical examination of the bell chamber above, where poor Horace Trench had met his end, Miss Marple remained in the ringing chamber below. Something about the arrangement of objects here continued to perplex her, and she had learned through long experience that such feelings were seldom without foundation. The watering can that had caught her attention hung innocuously from its peg, appearing to be nothing more than a mundane piece of church equipment. Yet, as she lifted it down for closer inspection, her suspicions proved justified. The tiny hole in the spout was indeed deliberate, perfectly round and cleaned, as though made with a sharp instrument. She carried the can to the narrow window where the morning light fell brightest. Tilting it carefully, she observed how a thin stream of water would issue from the pinhole when the vessel was filled. Not a steady pour, but a measured drip that would empty the container slowly and consistently. "Most ingenious," she murmured, though for what purpose such a device might be intended, she could not yet fathom Mrs. Pringle, who had been hovering anxiously near the chamber entrance, approached with her characteristic combination of curiosity and disapproval. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but what would you be wanting with that old thing? Nothing but a bother. It is always getting in the way when I'm trying to clean proper." "You're familiar with this particular can, Mrs. Pringle?" "Oh, yes, indeed. Been hanging there since before my time, I shouldn't wonder. We use it on sweeping days for damping down the dust, though I can't say I have much use for it otherwise." Mrs. Pringle sniffed dismissively. "More trouble than it's worth, if you ask me." Miss Marple examined the shelf beneath the can's usual position and discovered what she had half expected: a circular stain on the wood, darker than the surrounding surface and still faintly damp to the touch. The pattern was consistent with water dropping steadily from above over a considerable period. "Mrs. Pringle," she said thoughtfully, "when did you last have occasion to use this watering can?" The charwoman considered the question with the seriousness she accorded all matters relating to her professional duties. "Not for a fortnight at least, Miss Marple. We had our last proper cleaning before the harvest service, and I remember thinking then that the thing needed a good washing out, but I haven't touched it since." This was enlightening. If the can had not been used for cleaning purposes yet bore evidence of recent use, then someone had employed it for quite a different purpose. Miss Marple moved methodically about the chamber, following the trail of evidence that was beginning to emerge. On the stone floor near the great bell's axle, she discovered another drop mark, a single dark spot that could only be water. The position struck her as significant, for it lay directly beneath the path that liquid would take if it fell from the shelf where the watering can hung. The leather bucket, too, deserved further attention. Miss Marple examined it more closely, noting not only the tide mark she had observed earlier, but also the particular smell that clung to its interior. "Mrs. Pringle," she inquired, "this bucket, what is its usual purpose?" "Fire bucket. That has been here since I don't know when. Though I can't think why anyone would fill it with pond water. Nasty stuff, that is, and no good for putting out fires." The implications were becoming clearer. Someone had deliberately filled the bucket with pond water, hung it in a specific position, and arranged for the pinhole watering can to drip into it. But why pond water specifically? Miss Marple pondered this question as she continued her examination. In the workbox she had discovered earlier, further evidence awaited. The darning needle with its suspiciously bright point lay among the other sewing implements. But now she noticed something else, a small cork, the sort used to seal bottles bearing a fresh hole through its center, exactly the diameter one would expect if pierced by the very needle that lay beside it. How very methodical, Miss Marple observed to herself. Someone had tested their technique, ensuring the hole would be precisely the right size for their purpose. Dr. Haydock's voice echoed down from the bell chamber above. Miss Marple, you might find it interesting to see what Inspector Slack has discovered up here. She climbed the narrow stone steps that led to the upper chamber, where the great bells themselves hung in their massive wooden framework. The scene that greeted her was sobering indeed. The space was cramped and filled with the complex machinery of bell ringing, wheels, stays, and bearings that had served the church faithfully for centuries. Inspector Slack stood beside a wooden beam, his expression grim. Poor devil was struck by this stay here, he explained, indicating a heavy wooden lever that served as a brake for one of the larger bells. Crushed his skull like an eggshell. Must have been examining the bell when it moved unexpectedly. Miss Marple studied the arrangement with interest. The stay in question was part of the mechanism that controlled the great bell, the same bell whose voice had rung out so mysteriously the night before, but something about the position of the wooden brake struck her as odd. Inspector, might I ask? In what position was the bell found this morning? Slack consulted his notes. According to Potley here, she was standing up, mouth to the rafters, as he puts it. But that's what puzzled him, since he swears all the bells were left in the safe position last evening. Ezra Potley, who had remained silent during most of the investigation, stepped forward with evident reluctance. It's most irregular, Inspector. We never leave the bells up overnight. The strain on the bearings, you understand, and the danger if the stay should slip. Yet this bell was found up, Miss Marple observed. And the stay that killed poor Mr. Trench? Was it in its proper position? Potley examined the mechanism with the practiced eye of long experience. No, he admitted with obvious bewilderment. The stay appears to have been displaced. See here. He indicated a small metal washer that lay on the frame nearby. This wasn't here yesterday. I'm certain of it. Miss Marple picked up the washer, noting its copper composition and the faint green patina that spoke of recent handling. But there was something else, a smell that clung to the metal. She had encountered that particular odor before, though not in connection with church bells. Most curious, she murmured, turning the washer in her fingers. The scent was familiar, yet out of place in this setting. It reminded her of something related to musical instruments, though she could not immediately place it. As the investigation continued around her, Miss Marple found herself constructing a tentative theory. The pinhole in the watering can, the bucket position to catch the drips, the mysterious pond water, and now this displaced washer with its unusual smell. Each piece seemed to suggest a carefully planned sequence of events. But what could possibly connect a dripping watering? Can in the chamber below with a displaced bell stay in the chamber above? And why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths to achieve what appeared to be a tragic accident? The answer, she suspected, lay in understanding the precise timing of events. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that something would happen at exactly 10:03 on that stormy evening. The question was what, and more importantly, why? Chapter 4. Bucket ring, tide mark, the leather fire bucket yielded its secrets reluctantly. But Miss Marple's patient examination revealed details that might have escaped a less observant eye. The tide mark she had noticed earlier was indeed puzzling, positioned too high on the buckets. interior to represent ordinary mopping water, yet too clean and distinct to be the result of casual use. She lifted the bucket from its hook and held it to the light, studying the pale ring that circled its interior. The mark was perhaps 6 inches from the bottom, suggesting the bucket had been filled to a precise level and allowed to remain so for some time. Most tellingly, the ring showed no signs of the debris one would expect from rainwater or cleaning water. "Dr. Haydock," she called quietly to the physician, who was examining some architectural detail of the chamber with professional interest. "Might I impose upon your medical training for a moment?" The doctor approached, his weathered face curious. "Of course, Miss Marple. What have you discovered?" "This bucket," the watermark suggested, held perhaps 2 gallons of liquid. "Given the size and weight of such a quantity, what effect do you suppose it might have on the hook from which it hangs?" Dr. Haydock examined the iron hook with the thoroughness he might apply to a patient's symptoms. His findings were immediate and revealing. "Strain marks," he announced. "See here, the metal shows stress patterns where weight has pulled recently. And this orange discoloration along the hook's curve, that's iron bloom, the sort that appears when metal is subjected to unusual tension." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "So our bucket was indeed filled to that tide mark, and recently. The question becomes, filled with what and for what purpose?" Inspector Slack, having completed his examination of the bell chamber above, descended the stone steps with his characteristic heavy tread. His expression suggested that the straightforward explanation he had initially favored was proving disappointingly elusive. "Right then," he announced briskly, "we've established that someone broke in here last night, got up to the bell chamber, and met with an accident. But I'll admit there are aspects that puzzle me." He consulted his notebook with evident frustration. "The deceased appears to have been struck by this wooden stay when the bell moved unexpectedly. But according to our bell expert here," he nodded toward Potley, "the bell couldn't have moved unless it was first raised to the up position, which would require considerable effort and expertise." Ezra Potley stepped forward with his usual precision. "That's quite correct, Inspector. The great bell weighs nearly a ton. To raise her requires not only strength, but knowledge of the proper technique. It's not something one attempts without training." "Yet," Miss Marple interjected gently, "we know the bell did ring 3 times at 10:03. We all heard it quite distinctly." Harold Lyme, the clockmaker, had been examining the bell mechanism with the particular interest of one accustomed to complex machinery. His mild voice carried a note of professional skepticism. "If I may, Inspector, there's something rather odd about this entire arrangement. The bell was found in the up position this morning, yet the stay that should have held it secure was displaced. It's as though something interfered with the normal operation of the mechanism." Miss Marple returned her attention to the mysterious washer she had discovered near the displaced stay. The small copper disc bore traces of that distinctive smell she could not quite place, along with what appeared to be fresh scratches along its edges. "Mr. Lyme," she said thoughtfully, "as an expert in mechanical devices, what would you make of this?" The clockmaker accepted the washer and examined it with a jeweler's loupe he produced from his waistcoat pocket. His expression grew increasingly puzzled. "Most unusual," he murmured. "This appears to be a standard mechanical washer, but it's been modified recently. See these scratches? They suggest it's been forced into a position where it doesn't properly belong." "And the smell?" Miss Marple inquired. Lyme sniffed delicately at the metal. "Ah, yes, I detect it now. That's leather cement, the adhesive used in bookbinding and musical instrument repair. Quite distinctive once you recognize it." The significance of this revelation was not lost on Miss Marple. She glanced meaningfully toward Agnes Whitby, who stood pale and silent near the chamber entrance. As church organist, Miss Whitby would certainly be familiar with leather cement, used as it is in the maintenance of organ bellows and other components. "Miss Whitby," Miss Marple said gently. "I believe you mentioned practicing here yesterday evening. Might I ask what time you actually departed?" The organist's response was barely audible. I told you shortly before 9. Yes, but the Reverend Clement found the key much later than that. Might there have been some delay? Perhaps some difficulty with the organ that required additional attention? Agnes Whitby's composure cracked slightly. The bellows leather needed adjustment. One of the washers had worked loose. I had to apply cement and allow time for it to set properly. This explanation, while plausible, raised new questions in Miss Marple's mind. She moved to examine the bell framework more carefully, particularly the area around where the mysterious groove had been scored in the wooden beam. What she discovered there confirmed her growing suspicions. Caught in a splinter of the ancient wood was a single fiber, thin, brown, and unmistakably leather. Moreover, the groove itself showed signs of recent use, with a slight polish that spoke of something having been drawn across it repeatedly. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we may be dealing with something rather more complex than a simple breaking and entering. These various elements, the pinhole in the watering can, the bucket with its precise tide mark, this groove in the beam, and the displaced washer, they suggest a carefully orchestrated sequence of events." Slack's skepticism was evident. "What sort of sequence would that be, Miss Marple?" "I'm not entirely certain yet," she admitted, "but consider this. Someone went to considerable trouble to ensure that specific events would occur at a precise time. The evidence suggests a mechanism of sorts designed to function automatically." Dr. Haydock looked thoughtful. "You're suggesting this wasn't an accident at all, but some sort of elaborate trap." "The possibility cannot be dismissed," Miss Marple replied. "Though if so, it represents a most ingenious approach to murder, one that would allow the perpetrator to be elsewhere when the fatal moment arrived." She paused, studying the arrangement of clues that surrounded them. The leather bucket with its mysterious tide mark, the pinhole watering can designed to drip steadily, the groove in the beam suggesting some sort of cord or line, and the displaced washer that smelled of organ repair cement. Each piece seemed to point toward a single terrible conclusion. "I believe," she said slowly, "that we are looking at the components of a water clock, a device designed to measure time not through mechanical means, but through the steady accumulation of liquid. When the bucket reached its predetermined weight, something was triggered, something that caused the bell to ring and poor Mr. Trench to meet his death." The assembled group stared at her in various degrees of amazement and disbelief. It seemed impossible that such a medieval concept could be applied to 20th century murder. Yet the evidence before them suggested exactly that possibility. Inspector Slack frowned heavily. "That's all very well in theory, Miss Marple, but how would such a contraption actually work? And more to the point, who in this village would possess the knowledge to construct it?" Chapter 5: The Stay in the Washer Herald. Lime's gentle demeanor masked a sharp intelligence that had served him well in his profession of repairing the intricate mechanisms of clocks and watches. When Inspector Slack pressed him about the bell's unexpected movement, his response carried the authority of long experience with mechanical systems. "Inspector, you must understand that a bell left in the up position is held there by a single point of contact. The stay rests against a slider, creating what we call the balance point. Disturb that contact by even a fraction of an inch and the bell will swing of its own weight." He gestured toward the massive bronze bell that hung motionless above them. "She weighs 1,800 pounds, and gravity is always pulling her toward the down position. The stay and slider system is all that prevents her from swinging." Miss Marple studied the wooden stay with renewed interest. The heavy timber, worn smooth by decades of use, showed fresh scratches near its tip, where it should have contacted the slider mechanism. "Mr. Lime," she inquired, "what sort of force would be required to dislodge the stay from its proper position?" The clockmaker considered the question with characteristic precision. Not as much as you might suppose. The leverage involved means that a pull of perhaps 20 pounds applied at the right angle could be sufficient. The difficulty lies not in the force required, but in applying it at precisely the correct moment and position. Inspector Slack made notes with increasing skepticism. You're suggesting someone rigged up some sort of pulling device. That seems rather far-fetched. Nevertheless, Miss Marple observed mildly, we have the evidence of our own ears. The bell did ring at 10:03 despite being left in what should have been a secure position. She moved closer to examine the stay mechanism, noting how the copper washer she had discovered earlier would fit between the stay and its contact point. When properly positioned, such a washer would create just enough separation to make the hold unstable. "Dr. Haydock," she called, "might I trouble you to hold this washer in position while I observe the effect?" The physician obligingly placed the small copper disc where Miss Marple indicated. The result was immediately apparent. The stay no longer rested firmly against its stop, but balanced precariously, with only the washer preventing complete displacement. Ingenious, Harold Lyme admitted, his professional admiration evident despite the macabre circumstances. A carefully placed wedge that would hold temporarily, then give way under the right pressure. Agnes Whitby, who had remained silent throughout this demonstration, suddenly spoke up. "This is all very interesting, I'm sure, but surely you're not suggesting that poor Mr. Trench was deliberately—" Her voice faltered, unable to complete the terrible thought. Miss Marple turned her gentle gaze upon the organist. "Miss Whitby, you mentioned yesterday evening that you required extra time to repair some organ bellows. Might I ask what specific materials you used for this work?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Agnes's reaction was telling. Her hands trembled slightly as she replied, "The usual things. Leather cement, some washers to tighten the connections. Nothing unusual." "And these washers," Miss Marple continued with the persistence of a patient interviewer, "would they have been copper by any chance?" Yes, copper washers are standard for organ work. They don't corrode as readily as iron." Agnes's voice had grown very small indeed. Inspector Slack's attention sharpened. "You carry organ repair supplies with you regularly, Miss Whitby?" "When necessary, yes. One never knows when an adjustment might be needed during practice." She gestured toward a small canvas bag that sat near the chamber entrance. "I keep basic supplies in there." Miss Marple approached the bag with polite interest. "Might we examine the contents simply to eliminate possibilities, you understand?" Agnes nodded reluctantly, and Miss Marple carefully opened the bag. Inside were indeed the tools of an organist's trade: tuning forks, small wrenches, screwdrivers, and a small bottle of leather cement. But there was also a spool of thin cord and several copper washers identical to the one found near the displaced stay. "Most thorough," Miss Marple observed, "though I noticed the cord appears to have been cut recently. See how the end is cleanly severed, not frayed as it would be from ordinary wear." Harold Lyme examined the cord with his jeweler's loupe. "This is good quality line," he noted. "Strong enough to bear considerable tension, yet thin enough to run smoothly over pulleys or through small spaces." The implications were becoming increasingly clear, though Inspector Slack still struggled with the mechanical aspects. "Even supposing someone could rig up this contraption you're describing, how would they ensure it worked at the right time?" "You can't exactly set an alarm clock for murder." "Aha," Miss Marple replied with quiet satisfaction. "But you can create a timing mechanism using the steady drip of water. Consider, the pinhole in the watering can releases liquid at a predictable rate. The bucket below fills gradually until it reaches a predetermined weight. At that moment, the increased load triggers some mechanical action." She moved to demonstrate her theory, positioning herself near the groove she had observed in the wooden beam. A cord could run from the weighted bucket, Over this beam, which would explain the fresh scoring we observed, and up to the bell chamber above, where it could be attached to the washer holding the stay in position. Dr. Haydock followed her reasoning with growing amazement. When the bucket reached sufficient weight, it would pull the cord taut, dislodging the washer and releasing the bell to swing precisely. And the beauty of such a system is that it requires no human presence at the crucial moment. The perpetrator could establish their alibi elsewhere, while the mechanism operated automatically. Agnes Whitby had grown increasingly pale during this explanation. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of desperation. Even if such a thing were possible, you've no proof that anyone specific. Miss Marple's expression remained kindly but determined. I'm afraid there are several troubling connections, my dear. The leather cement on the washer matches that in your repair kit. The copper washer itself is identical to those you carry. And most significantly, there are traces of leather dust on the chamber stairs, the sort that would fall when cutting leather cord with a sharp knife. She paused, allowing the weight of evidence to settle upon the group. Moreover, the timing of the mechanism points to someone with intimate knowledge of church routines. 3 minutes past 10 would ensure that evening prayers were concluded and the vicar safely in his study, while being late enough that most villagers would be abed. Harold Lyme had been quietly examining the remaining evidence with professional interest. Miss Marple, he said slowly, there's one aspect that puzzles me. My alibi for last evening is quite solid. I was at Mrs. Weatherby's house from 9 until nearly 11, repairing her grandfather clock. Her parrot can attest to my presence, as it spent the entire time insulting my appearance. Indeed, Mr. Lyme, Miss Marple agreed. Your alibi is unquestionable, which is precisely why you make such an excellent red herring. Someone with your mechanical knowledge would be the obvious suspect for such an elaborate device. But the true perpetrator needed you to be elsewhere, beyond suspicion, when their water clock reached its fatal conclusion. The truth was emerging like a photograph in developing solution, each detail becoming clearer as the chemical process revealed what had been hidden. Agnes Whitby stood motionless, her face a study in defeat and despair, while around her the evidence of her carefully planned crime continued to accumulate with inexorable logic. Chapter 6. Clockmaker's Alibi. Organist Harold Lyme. His alibi proved to be as solid as the timepieces he repaired. Mrs. Weatherby, a formidable widow of 73, confirmed his presence at her cottage with the sort of detailed precision that comes naturally to those accustomed to managing household staff and keeping accurate accounts. Arrived at 9 sharp. He did, she declared when Inspector Slack visited her modest dwelling on Vicarage Lane. I heard the church clock strike the half-hour just as he knocked. Punctual as always, Mr. Lyme. She led them to the sitting room where a magnificent grandfather clock stood silent, its pendulum motionless behind glass panels. Been stopping at 10 minutes to 4 for the better part of a month. Drives me quite distracted, hearing it chime at all hours when it shouldn't. Harold Lyme had accompanied them to complete his repairs, and he worked with the quiet efficiency that marked all his professional endeavors. As he adjusted the escapement mechanism, Mrs. Weatherby continued her testimony with evident relish. He was here until nearly 11, working on the blessed thing. Never stopped muttering about weights and springs and such. She gestured toward an ornate cage in the corner, where a large green parrot regarded them with intelligent malice. Nelson there took quite a dislike to him, didn't you, my dear? The parrot, apparently recognizing Harold Lyme, immediately launched into a stream of colorful invective that would have made a sailor blush. Ugly little man! It screeched with considerable vehemence. Tick-tock, fool! Go away, go away! Mrs. Weatherby beamed with proprietorial pride. Nelson's quite particular about who he approves of. Been calling Mr. Lyme names since the moment he arrived last evening. Kept it up for the full hour and a half he was... Here, Inspector Slack made careful notes of the timing. The parrot's vocal performance provided an unusually reliable witness to Harold Lyme's whereabouts during the crucial period when the murder mechanism would have been operating. And you're certain of the times, Mrs. Weatherby? Absolutely certain, Inspector. I always listen for the church bells to mark the hours. Heard them strike 10 while Mr. Lyme was fussing with the clocks. Then that strange business at 3 minutes past. 3 slow strokes that shouldn't have been there at all. Ask Mr. Lyme about it. I did, but he said it wasn't normal bell practice. This confirmed what they already knew, but it also eliminated Harold Lyme as a suspect beyond any reasonable doubt. His presence at Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, vouched for by both the widow and her loquacious bird, made it impossible for him to have been in the bell tower. When the fatal mechanism activated, the focus of suspicion, therefore, returned inevitably to Agnes Whitby, and her increasingly problematic account of the previous evening's events. When they returned to the church, Miss Marple took it upon herself to explore this aspect more thoroughly. "Miss Whitby," she said gently, settling beside the organist on one of the wooden benches in the ringing chamber, "I wonder if you might clarify something that's been troubling me. You mentioned returning the vestry key through the vicarage letter slot at 20 minutes to 9. Yet Reverend Clement didn't find it there until 9:15. Agnes twisted her hands nervously. "I may have been mistaken about the exact time. One doesn't always notice such details when one's mind is occupied with musical matters." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed sympathetically. "Though I noticed something rather interesting in your hymn book during the service last Sunday." She produced the worn volume from Agnes's bag, opening it to a well-marked page. Here at the hymn, "O Strength and Stay," you've written 103 in pencil beside the title. The color drained from Agnes's face. That's simply a note about tempo. The organist must keep track of such things." "How curious," Miss Marple observed mildly. "I've never known tempo to be marked in hours and minutes, and this particular marking appears quite fresh. The pencil graphite is still sharp-edged, not worn, as it would be from repeated handling." Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, stepped closer to examine the hymnal. "Miss Marple's quite right. This notation was made recently, within the last day or two, I'd estimate. The significance of the timing was not lost on anyone present. 10:03 was precisely when the mysterious bell strokes had sounded across the sleeping village, and when poor Horace Trench had met his death. In the chamber above, Agnes seemed to realize that her position was becoming increasingly untenable. "Even if I did make some note about the bells," she said desperately, "that proves nothing. Anyone might have—" But there's more, I'm afraid," Miss Marple interrupted with regret. "The Reverend Clement has been kind enough to check his records, and he confirms that you didn't return the key when you claimed. In fact, the letter slot was empty when he checked at 9:15, which he does as part of his evening routine." Reverend Clement nodded gravely. "I'm afraid that's quite accurate. I always secure the vicarage before retiring, and I distinctly remember the key wasn't there at 9:15. I found it later, tucked rather carelessly under the doormat, but not until I made my final check before bed." This revelation struck at the heart of Agnes's alibi. If she hadn't returned the key until after 9:15, it meant she had remained at the church much longer than she claimed, long enough to set up the elaborate timing mechanism that Miss Marple had theorized. "There's also the matter of the bellows repair you mentioned," Miss Marple continued relentlessly but kindly. "When Inspector Slack examined the organ this morning, he found no evidence of recent maintenance work. The bellows leather appears to be in the same condition it's been in for months." Agnes's composure finally cracked. There may have been some confusion about what work was actually required. Sometimes one thinks repairs are necessary, but upon closer examination—" Her voice trailed off as she realized how unconvincing her explanation sounded. The weight of accumulated evidence was becoming impossible to bear, and her shoulders sagged with the burden of her guilty knowledge. Miss Marple reached out to place a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "My dear, I think it would be best if you told us the truth. Whatever drove you to such desperate measures, concealment will only make matters worse." For a long moment, Agnes stared at her hands, struggling with some internal battle between confession and continued denial. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He was going to destroy it," she said brokenly. "My father's memorial, the organ that was installed in his memory after he died in the war. Trench said it was too expensive to maintain, that the church needed modern heating instead of sentimental nonsense." The pathos in her voice was unmistakable, and even Inspector Slack seemed moved by the depth of her emotion. But Miss Marple, while sympathetic, knew that understanding a motive did not excuse the terrible crime that had been committed. "So you devised a way to frighten him?" she said quietly. "A warning, perhaps, that would make him reconsider his plans?" Agnes nodded miserably. "I never meant for him to die. I thought he would hear the bell and leave, that the shock would teach him to respect what he was trying to destroy." Chapter 7. Soot on the Louverty. Ancient stone louvers of St. Luke's Tower had weathered centuries of English storms. Their slanted openings designed to let sound carry, while keeping rain from the bell chamber within. Miss Marple examined them with the methodical attention she might have given to a complex knitting pattern, noting how each opening was blackened with the accumulated soot of decades, all save one. On the north-facing louver, a thin line of darker residue marked the stone, too fresh to be merely another layer of ancient grime, too deliberate to be coincidental. She drew her finger along the mark, collecting a smudge of black powder that had the distinctive feel of fresh soot. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe we have further evidence of our mysterious mechanism." Slack approached with his customary skepticism, but even he could see that something had recently disturbed the normal accumulation of dirt on the stonework. The line ran horizontally along the inner edge of the louver, precisely where a cord might pass through the opening under tension. "Looks like something was drawn across here right enough," he admitted grudgingly, "but I still don't see how all these bits and pieces add up to murder." Miss Marple turned her attention to the wooden framework within the bell chamber, searching for other traces of the mechanism. She was beginning to understand. What she discovered confirmed her growing certainty about the method. Employed embedded in one of the ancient oak beams was a small iron hook, so recently installed that bright metal showed where it had been screwed into the wood. The hook was positioned directly in line with the soot mark on the louver and bore the telltale scratches that spoke of rope or cord having passed through. "Its eye under considerable strain, Ezra?" she addressed the verger, who had been watching her investigation with increasing unease. "This hook, was it present when you last inspected the bell chamber?" Potley examined the fixture with the thoroughness of a man responsible for every detail of church maintenance. "Certainly not, Miss Marple. I would have noticed such an addition immediately. My duties require me to know every bolt and timber in this tower." His certainty was absolute, and Miss Marple had no reason to doubt it. Someone had installed this hook within the past few days, creating an anchor point for their deadly contraption. Agnes Whitby stood frozen near the chamber entrance, her face a mask of growing despair as each piece of evidence emerged to condemn her. When Miss Marple's gaze fell upon her, she seemed to shrink further into herself. "The installation of such a hook would require proper tools," Miss Marple observed conversationally. "A drill for the pilot hole, a screwdriver for the mounting, not the sort of implements one typically carries for organ maintenance." She moved to examine Agnes's canvas supply bag more thoroughly, noting items that had escaped her earlier inspection. Beneath the legitimate tools of the organist's trade lay items that seemed out of place. A small hand drill, several wood screws, and a compact screwdriver with a worn wooden handle. "Miss Whitby," she said gently, "might I ask why you carry carpentry tools among your musical supplies?" Agnes's voice was barely audible. "The organ bench sometimes needs adjustment. The wood swells in damp weather, and the hinges require tightening." It was a plausible explanation and might have satisfied a less observant investigator. But Miss Marple had noticed something else: wood shavings clinging to the drill bit, fresh and pale against the metal. The shavings matched the oak timber of the bell frame exactly. Dr. Haydock had been following the investigation with the clinical detachment of his profession, but now his expression showed growing comprehension. "Miss Marple, you're suggesting that Miss Whitby not only devised this timing mechanism, but installed the hardware necessary for its operation." "The evidence certainly points in that direction," Miss Marple replied. She had found another significant clue: a small bench drawer that contained what appeared to be leather scraps and offcuts. Among them was a piece that caught her attention immediately. The leather strip bore the distinctive marks of having been cut with a sharp knife, its edges clean and purposeful. More significantly, one end showed a small notch or groove, as though it had been used to attach or hold something in position. "This appears to be a section of organ bellows leather," Miss Marple observed, holding the strip to the light, "but it's been modified for quite a different purpose." Harold Lyme, whose professional expertise encompassed all manner of mechanical contrivances, examined the leather piece with interest. "The notch at the end would serve as an attachment point," he concluded. "Something could be hooked or tied there with considerable security." The pattern was becoming clearer with each discovery: the leather strip, the iron hook in the beam, the soot mark on the louver, all components of a system designed to operate across the distance between the ringing chamber below and the bell chamber above. Miss Marple reconstructed the mechanism in her mind's eye. The weighted bucket, when it reached the predetermined level, would pull a cord that ran from the ringing chamber up through the louver opening. The cord would pass through the hook we discovered and connect to the copper washer holding the bell stay in position. She demonstrated by tracing the imagined path with her finger. When sufficient tension was applied, the washer would be pulled free, releasing the stay and allowing the bell to swing under its own tremendous weight. Inspector Slack was beginning to grasp the diabolical ingenuity of the scheme, and the person who set it up could be miles away when it operated with a perfect alibi for the time of death, precisely. Though in this case, I suspect the perpetrator remained close enough to hear the result of their handiwork. 3 strokes at 10:03, a very personal message to the intended victim. Agnes Whitby's composure had finally shattered completely. She sank onto one of the wooden benches, her face buried in her hands as the full weight of her actions pressed upon her. "I never meant for him to be hurt," she whispered through her fingers. "I thought he would hear the bell beginning to move and flee. I wanted him frightened, not—" She could not bring herself to say the word. Miss Marple's expression softened with genuine sympathy, though her voice remained firm. "But you lured him up here deliberately, didn't you, my dear? Some message or communication that would ensure his presence in the bell chamber at the crucial moment?" Agnes nodded miserably. "I sent a note, unsigned, suggesting that vandals had damaged something in the tower. I knew his sense of responsibility would compel him to investigate immediately, regardless of the weather or the hour." The confession hung in the air like incense, heavy with the weight of desperate choices and unintended consequences. Agnes Whitby had planned what she believed would be a harmless fright, a dramatic warning that would preserve her father's memorial. Instead, she had created an inexorable sequence of events that led inevitably to tragedy. The timing had to be precise, Miss Marple continued, pursuing the logic of the crime to its conclusion. You calculated how long the water would take to drip from the pinhole into the bucket. How much weight would be needed to trigger the mechanism. It required considerable planning and no small amount of mechanical knowledge. I tested it, Agnes admitted in a voice barely above a whisper, several times with smaller amounts of water to perfect the timing. I thought I had accounted for every variable, every possibility, except that Horace Trench would position himself directly in the path of the swinging bell. Miss Marple finished sadly. You had created a trap far more deadly than you ever intended. Chapter 8. The Pencil in the Prayer Book, the Lie. Vestry of St. Luke's had served for generations as a repository for the accumulated business of parish life. Robes hung in neat rows along one wall, while a heavy oak table bore the weight of ledgers, correspondence, and the various implements of ecclesiastical administration. It was here that Horace Trench had left his personal effects on that fatal evening, hanging his overcoat on the customary peg beside the door. Inspector Slack had examined the coat earlier, but found nothing of obvious significance, just a few coins, a pencil stub, and the usual detritus that accumulates in a gentleman's pockets. Now, however, Miss Marple's more thorough investigation revealed details that had escaped the inspector's initial scrutiny. In the inner breast pocket, folded small and tucked behind a leather wallet, lay a piece of paper that bore the unmistakable signs of hasty composition. The handwriting was disguised but recognizable, and the message brief but compelling. Pay the organ now or I close the tower. Miss Marple read the note aloud, noting how the final initials were formed in a slightly different hand than the rest of the message. The paper itself was ordinary foolscap, but the pencil mark showed the hesitation of someone unaccustomed to forgery. Most interesting, she murmured, examining the note more closely. This appears to be Mr. Trench's own ultimatum regarding the organ repairs, but written in someone else's hand. Dr. Haydock peered over her shoulder at the incriminating document. Rather crude forgery, isn't it? The initials don't match the body of the text at all. Agnes Whitby had grown increasingly pale as each piece of evidence emerged, but this discovery seemed to affect her more profoundly than the others. Her hands trembled as she recognized the implications of what Miss Marple had found. This note, Inspector Slack said slowly, would certainly provide motive for someone to want Trench out of the way. But why would the killer leave it on the victim's person? Miss Marple had moved to examine the vestry's collection of prayer books and hymnals, her fingers trailing along the worn spines with practiced familiarity. In a book of common prayer that showed signs of frequent use, she discovered another significant clue. Tucked between the pages containing the evening service was a folded document that bore the official seal of the church trust. Miss Marple extracted it carefully, noting how it had been creased and worried by nervous handling. An IOU, she announced, spreading the paper flat on the vestry table, made out to Ezra Potley for unpaid quarry stone in the amount of 47, signed by Horace Trench. This revelation cast new light on the relationships within the church community. Ezra Potley, the methodical verger, stepped forward with obvious reluctance to examine the document. "That's my signature as witness," he admitted quietly. Mr. Trench had fallen behind in his payments to our quarry for the tower repairs last spring. He asked for additional time, offering this note as security. Inspector Slack made careful notes of this development. Financial disputes provided excellent motives for murder, particularly when the sums involved represented significant hardship for working men like Potley. 47 is no small matter for a verger's wages, Slack observed. That's nearly 3 months' salary, I'd estimate. But Miss Marple discovered something else of interest in the prayer book. Marginal. Notations that revealed more about the victim's state of mind than any formal document could. Convey, beside the psalm for evening prayer, Someone had written in pencil, "Agnes grows desperate. Watch her closely." The handwriting was unmistakably Trench's, and the date penciled beside it was only 3 days prior to his death. It seemed the church warden had been aware of tensions regarding the organ controversy and had taken note of Agnes Whitby's increasing distress. "He knew," Agnes said suddenly, her voice breaking with emotion. "He knew how much the organ meant to me, to my father's memory, and he simply didn't care." Miss Marple regarded the young woman with compassion, recognizing the pain that had driven her to such desperate measures. "Your father served in the war, didn't he, my dear?" Agnes nodded, tears beginning to flow freely. "Killed at Passchendaele in 1917. I was only 12 when the telegram came. The organ was installed 2 years later when the parish raised funds for a proper memorial. It's all I have left of him." The pathos of the situation was not lost on anyone present. The church organ represented far more than a musical instrument to Agnes Whitby. It was the tangible connection to a father she had barely known, a memorial that validated his sacrifice and her loss. But Mr. Trench saw only the practical concerns, Miss Marple said gently. The cost of maintenance, the need for modern heating. He couldn't understand the emotional significance Dr. Haydock had been examining, the various documents with the detached perspective of an outsider. It appears there were several sources of friction in the parish. The unpaid debt to Potley, the organ controversy, questions about the allocation of trust funds. Indeed, further examination of the vestry records revealed a complex web of financial pressures that had been building for months. The church trust had limited resources, and competing demands for essential repairs had created an atmosphere of tension and resentment. Miss Marple found additional correspondence that illuminated the scope of the problem, letters from the diocesan office, warning of necessary structural repairs to the tower itself, while estimates from contractors painted a sobering picture of the costs involved. Mr. Trench was faced with impossible choices, she observed. The organ repairs Agnes desperately wanted, the money owed to Potley's quarry, the structural work required for safety, all competing for insufficient funds. Agnes had sunk into one of the vestry chairs, overwhelmed by the accumulating evidence of her crime and the futility of her actions. Thought if I could frighten him, make him realize how serious I was about preserving the organ, he might find another way to manage the finances. But you chose a method that required his death to be effective, Miss Marple said quietly. The water clock mechanism you devised could only work if someone was in the bell chamber when the stay was released. The terrible logic of the crime was becoming inescapable. Agnes had not simply planned to frighten Horace Trench. Whether consciously or not, she had designed a trap that required his presence at a specific location and time. The forged note that lured him to the tower, the precise timing of the mechanism, the calculated positioning of all the elements. Everything pointed to premeditated murder, regardless of her stated intentions. Inspector Slack had been making extensive notes throughout the investigation, and now he closed his notebook with an air of finality. Miss Whitby, I'm afraid I must ask you to accompany me to the station for formal questioning. The evidence suggests— Wait, Agnes interrupted, rising unsteadily from her chair. There's something else you should know. Something that makes this even worse than you imagine. Miss Marple waited patiently, knowing that the complete truth was finally ready to emerge. The young woman's composure had cracked entirely, and the burden of her secret was becoming unbearable. The note I sent to Mr. Trench, Agnes continued in a whisper. I told him that someone had been tampering with the bells, that there might be damage to the mechanisms. I knew his sense of responsibility would compel him to investigate immediately. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. Agnes Whitby had not simply created a deadly trap. She had deliberately lured her victim into it with calculated precision. ensuring that Horace Trench would be standing in exactly the right position when her mechanism activated. "You made certain he would be there," Miss Marple said sadly. "In the bell chamber at 10:03, standing near enough to the great bell to be struck when it swung free." Chapter 9. Ringing Chamber, Water. Wait wheel. With all the components of the crime now laid bare before them, Miss Marple took it upon herself to demonstrate the full operation of Agnes Whitby's ingenious but deadly mechanism. The assembled group gathered in the ringing chamber as she began her methodical reconstruction of that fatal evening's events. If we may imagine the scene, she began, positioning herself near the leather fire bucket that hung from its iron hook. Agnes arrived here sometime after 8:30, carrying her usual supply bag, along with certain additional items she had carefully prepared. She lifted the bucket down and examined it once more, noting the precise tide mark that had first caught her attention. The first step was to fill this bucket to a predetermined level, not with clean water, which might have been noticed and questioned, but with pond water that would leave no obvious trace of tampering. Dr. Haydock followed her reasoning with professional interest. The pond water would be naturally murky, disguising any evidence that the bucket had been deliberately filled rather than accidentally contaminated. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Quite so. Agnes had calculated exactly how much weight would be required to trigger her mechanism, and the tide mark shows us that precise measurement, approximately 2 gallons of water, weighing roughly 16 pounds. She moved to demonstrate the next phase of the operation, lifting the modified watering can from its peg. This humble vessel was converted into a timing device through the simple expedient of creating a pinhole in the spout. Agnes tested the rate of flow carefully, determining exactly how long it would take for sufficient water to drip into the bucket below. Inspector Slack remained skeptical about the mechanical aspects of the crime. All well and good, Miss Marple, but how does water dripping into a bucket cause a bell to ring itself? "Uh-huh," Miss Marple replied with quiet satisfaction. "But you can create a timing mechanism using the steady drip of water. Consider, the pinhole in the watering can releases liquid at a predictable rate. The bucket below fills gradually until it reaches a predetermined weight. At that moment, the increased load triggers some mechanical action." She moved to the wooden beam, where she had first noticed the telltale groove. A cord was attached to the bucket handle and run along this beam, where it left the faint polish mark we observed. The cord then passed through the louver opening, accounting for the soot disturbance we discovered, and up to the bell chamber above. Harold Lyme, with his clockmaker's appreciation for precision mechanisms, began to grasp the elegant simplicity of the design. The bucket serves as a counterweight. As it fills with the dripping water, it grows heavier until it reaches the point where its weight exceeds the resistance holding the bell stay in position. "Exactly," Miss Marple confirmed. In the bell chamber above, the cord was attached to the copper washer that Agnes had wedged between the stay and its contact point. When sufficient tension was applied from below, the washer would be pulled free, releasing the massive bell to swing under its own weight. She paused, allowing the group to absorb the mechanical principles involved. The beauty of such a system lies in its inevitability. Once set in motion, the water clock operates automatically, requiring no human presence to complete its deadly work. Agnes Whitby sat motionless on one of the wooden benches, her face a mask of despair as the full scope of her crime was laid out with inexorable logic. When she spoke, her voice carried the hollow tone of someone who had lost all hope of redemption. "I tested it 3 times, she admitted quietly, with smaller amounts of water, different positions for the bucket. I thought I had perfected the timing so that the bell would ring just as Mr. Trench entered the chamber, frightening him away before any harm could come to him." Miss Marple's expression reflected both understanding and profound sadness. "But you miscalculated the human element, my dear. You couldn't predict exactly where he would position himself when he heard the mechanism beginning to operate. Dr. Haydock had been examining the iron hook in the beam where the bucket normally hung, noting the stress marks that confirmed the unusual weight it had recently supported. The leverage involved would be considerable. A bucket holding 16 pounds of water, suspended at this angle, would generate tremendous pulling force on any cord attached to it. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. And that force, transmitted through the cord system Agnes had so carefully arranged, proved more than sufficient to dislodge the washer and release the stay that held the grate. Bell in its raised position, she moved to the area directly below the bell chamber where water drops had fallen during the mechanism's operation. The evidence tells us that the system functioned exactly as designed. Water dripped steadily from the pinhole in the can, accumulated in the bucket until it reached the critical weight, then triggered the sequence of events that led to Mr. Trench's death. Ezra Potley had been following the explanation with the careful attention of a man whose life's work involved understanding complex mechanical systems. The timing would have to be calculated with extraordinary precision, he observed. Any error in the water flow rate, the bucket capacity, or the cord tension could cause the mechanism to fail entirely. Agnes looked up at him with haunted eyes. I spent weeks perfecting it. I knew Mr. Trench's habits, when he would respond to the message I planned to send, how long it would take him to reach the bell chamber. I thought I could time everything so precisely that he would be warned away by the sound of the bell beginning to move. But mechanical systems, however cleverly designed, cannot account for human unpredictability, Miss Marple said gently. You created a trap that functioned flawlessly from an engineering standpoint, but you couldn't control the actions of your intended victim once he entered the chamber. The tragic irony of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. Agnes had devoted considerable intelligence and planning to what she believed would be an elaborate but harmless warning. Instead, she'd created a murder weapon of medieval ingenuity, operating with clockwork precision. Inspector Slack had been making detailed notes throughout the demonstration, and now he looked up from his notebook with grim satisfaction. Well then, Miss Whitby, I think we've heard quite enough to understand what happened here. The evidence is overwhelming, and your own admissions confirm the deliberate nature of this crime. Agnes rose unsteadily from the bench, her composure finally completely shattered. I never wanted him to die, she repeated desperately. I thought I could frighten him into reconsidering, make him understand how important the organ was to me. But once I set the mechanism in motion, there was no way to stop it. Miss Marple regarded her with profound compassion, recognizing the desperate grief that had driven a respectable young woman to such extreme measures. My dear, I believe you when you say you didn't intend murder, but intention and result are not always the same thing. And the law must consider the consequences of our actions regardless of what we hope to achieve. The investigation was drawing to its inevitable conclusion, but one question remained unanswered. Miss Marple turned to Agnes with genuine curiosity about the final detail that had puzzled her from the beginning. The 3 strokes we all heard at 10:03. Was that also part of your calculation? The number of times the bell would ring before settling into its final position? Agnes nodded miserably. I had observed that a bell released from the up position would typically swing 3 times before the stay engaged again, bringing it to rest. I thought the sound would serve as a dramatic warning. 3 slow, deliberate strokes that would announce my message about respecting the memorial to my father. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the final touch of bitter irony in a crime that had been conceived as a memorial to the dead, but had succeeded only in creating another tragedy for the living. Chapter 10. Church Porch. The Line. That dripped, The ancient stone porch of St. Luke's Church had weathered countless storms over the centuries, its thick walls and deep archway providing shelter for generations of worshippers caught in sudden downpours. Now, as the investigation drew to its somber conclusion, it served as a fitting sanctuary where Miss Marple could gather her thoughts and present the final threads of evidence that would complete the tragic tapestry of Agnes Whitby's crime. The morning rain had ceased, leaving the air crisp and washed clean, but the dampness still clung to the stone surfaces and dripped steadily from the gargoyles that adorned the tower. Above, it was this persistent dripping that had first sparked Miss Marple's understanding of the murder. Method, water as timekeeper, gravity as executioner, and human desperation as the driving force behind it all. Inspector Slack stood with his notebook ready, prepared to record Miss Marple's final summary of the case. Around them gathered the principal figures in the drama. Dr. Haydock with his medical perspective, the Reverend Clement bearing the weight of pastoral responsibility, Ezra Potley still stunned by the revelation of violence in his carefully ordered domain, and Harold Lyme, whose mechanical expertise had helped unravel the ingenuity of the murder weapon. Agnes Whitby sat apart on the stone bench built into the porch wall, her hands folded in her lap, her face bearing the resigned expression of one who had finally abandoned all pretense and accepted the consequences of her actions. When I reflect upon this case, Miss Marple began quietly, I am struck by how completely it demonstrates the danger of allowing grief and desperation to overcome moral judgment. What began as a daughter's desire to preserve her father's memory became a calculated act of vengeance that destroyed far more than it sought to protect. She moved to stand near the entrance to the church where the afternoon light illuminated the worn stone steps that had witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow. The method employed shows both considerable intelligence and tragic short-sightedness. Agnes created what was essentially a medieval siege engine, a water clock combined with a mechanical trap. But she failed to consider that such devices, once activated, cannot be recalled or controlled. Dr. Haydock had been contemplating the psychological aspects of the crime throughout the investigation. The planning required must have taken weeks, possibly months. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a carefully premeditated act disguised as an elaborate warning. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, and that is what makes it particularly tragic. Agnes had ample time to reconsider, to find other solutions to her dilemma. The church trust funds could have been reorganized, alternative funding sources explored, compromises reached. But grief has a way of narrowing one's vision until only the most extreme options seem viable. She turned to address Agnes directly, her voice gentle but uncompromising. My dear, you possessed all the skills necessary to create your water clock mechanism. Your knowledge of organ maintenance provided expertise with leather cement and copper washers. Your familiarity with church routines allowed you to predict Mr. Trench's movements with fatal accuracy. But most tellingly, your carpenter's tools revealed that this was no spontaneous act of desperation. Agnes looked up with eyes that held no hope of reprieve, kept thinking there must be another way, some solution that would save both the organ and avoid harming anyone. But Mr. Trench was so adamant, so dismissive of anything that didn't serve his notion of practical necessity. Yet you chose to communicate through violence rather than persistence, Miss Marple observed sadly. You might have appealed to the bishop, organized the congregation, even raised funds independently. Instead, you decided that fear would be more persuasive than reason. Inspector Slack consulted his notes one final time before making his official summary. The evidence is conclusive on all points. The pinhole watering can create a predictable drip rate. The leather bucket served as a counterweight mechanism. The cord system transmitted the force to the bell chamber above. The copper washer treated with organ bellows Cement held the bell stay in temporary position until pulled free by the accumulated weight. He looked directly at Agnes as he continued. The forged note lured the victim to the precise location at the calculated time. The mechanism operated exactly as designed, and the result was the death of Horace Trench, struck by the stay of a bell that had been converted into a murder weapon through deliberate human artifice. Harold Lyme had remained largely silent during this final summation, but now he spoke with the quiet authority of professional expertise. I must say, from a purely mechanical standpoint, it was an ingenious device. The principles involved are sound, the execution remarkably precise. But engineering skill applied to murderous purpose creates an abomination, not an achievement. The Reverend Clement, who had struggled throughout the investigation to reconcile his pastoral duties with the demands of justice, finally found his voice. Miss Whitby, I want you to know that the church community will not abandon you in the difficult times ahead. Whatever your sentence, whenever you are released, there will be a place for you here if you choose to accept it. Agnes's composure broke entirely at this unexpected offer of future redemption. Through her tears, she managed to whisper, "The organ. What will happen to my father's memorial?" Miss Marple exchanged glances with the vicar before answering. "I believe the congregation will find a way to preserve it, my dear. Your father's sacrifice deserves remembrance, even if the method you chose to protect that memory was tragically misguided." As Inspector Slack prepared to escort Agnes to his waiting motor car, Miss Marple offered one final observation that captured the essential sadness of the entire affair. This case reminds us that the most dangerous criminals are often not those driven by greed or hatred, but those motivated by love turned desperate and reason corrupted by grief. Agnes Whitby's crime was born of filial devotion, but devotion without moral restraint becomes indistinguishable from obsession. The small procession made its way from the church porch to the waiting vehicle. Agnes walked with dignity despite her circumstances, accepting the support offered by Dr. Haydock when her steps faltered on the wet cobblestones. As the motor car disappeared around the corner of the high street, carrying Agnes toward an uncertain future, Miss Marple remained in the churchyard with her friend, Lady Bantry, who had arrived just as the formal proceedings concluded. "Quite a business, Jane," Dolly Bantry observed, glancing up at the tower where the great bell hung silent once more. "When we heard those strokes last evening, I thought it might be some supernatural manifestation. It certainly sounded ghostly enough in that storm." Miss Marple smiled sadly as she folded her knitting, which had remained untouched throughout the morning's dramatic revelations. "Ghosts seldom ring to time, my dear Dolly, but buckets and pinholes keep remarkably accurate schedules, especially when guided by human intelligence applied to unholy purpose." As they walked slowly toward the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the eternal truth that every mystery ultimately reveals: that human nature, in all its complexity of love and hatred, wisdom and folly, remains the most unpredictable element in any equation, mechanical or otherwise.